Language is basic to all human interaction. We use language to reveal who and what we are, to express our individual needs and values, to communicate concerns, ideas, and solutions, and to connect with one another in meaningful and productive ways. In many of our daily interactions, we use our language to communicate naturally, without much conscious or deliberate planning and effort. That is, until communication breaks down, and we are reminded of the importance and necessity for clear, accessible communication. In our ever-changing and fast-paced society, communication accessibility is central to our ability to do well at work, home, and within our communities. Communication accessibility becomes even more critical when individuals who need to communicate with one another do not share a common language or mode of communication. Such is often the case between deaf and hearing persons. One alternative for making communication accessible between deaf and hearing persons is to use an interpreter. An interpreter is an individual who is fluent in 2 or more languages and can accurately convey messages rendered in one language into another language. This videotape is designed to provide an overview of the role of a sign language interpreter and introduce techniques for working with sign language interpreters in one-to-one, small group, and large group situations. We will begin by discussing the history of sign language interpreting. In his book entitled When the Mind Hears, Harlan Lane summarizes one of the earliest written descriptions of sign language interpretation. In this book, Lane describes how Thomas Gallaudet interpreted for Laurent Clerc, a French deaf man who had come to America in 1815 to help establish schools for deaf people. It is likely, however, that interpreting between hearing and deaf persons occurred long before this time period. Hearing people who had regular contact with deaf persons became familiar with the language of signs and would help out by relaying ideas and thoughts between deaf and hearing persons. Often this role was filled by family members, neighbors, religious workers, or friends. However, these individuals were usually volunteers and were not professionally prepared to interpret. Often the quality and accuracy of their work was limited by a superficial knowledge of the language and culture of deaf persons. Of course, we must remember that these individuals worked during a social era when little was known about the complexities of American Sign Language or the culture of deaf people. Until recent years, uninformed attitudes about deaf people and their language use have caused many hearing people to think of deaf people as intellectual and social inferiors with poor language skills. The 60s brought about numerous changes in social attitudes and legislation governing the rights of disabled people to access services and programs. For deaf people, this meant the elimination of communication barriers via interpreters, captioning, telecommunication devices, and hearing persons learning to communicate in sign language. There were amendments to the Vocational Rehabilitation Act in 1965 that authorized the use of sign language interpreters for deaf persons receiving services. Numerous state laws were adopted that required qualified interpreters to be hired for court and administrative proceedings. In 1964, the Rehabilitation Services Administration encouraged a group of rehabilitation workers, educators of the deaf, and interpreters to establish standards for individuals who would be employed as interpreters for deaf persons. During the course of a year, 3 meetings were conducted, which resulted in the establishment of a national organization for interpreters. This organization, now known as the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf, RID, set out to recruit and educate interpreters, maintain a list of qualified interpreters, and to establish a set of ethical standards. Over a period of years, standards for qualified interpreters were developed, and the RID began testing interpreters in 1972. Between 1972 and 1990, several thousand interpreters were tested by the RID. Indeed, RID certification has become the standard in many state laws. The RID, which maintains a national office in the Washington, D.C. area, has evolved into a professional association which tests and certifies interpreters, maintains a registry of certified interpreters, promotes ethical standards, has established affiliates nationwide, provides information about education and employment of interpreters, and promotes appropriate working conditions for interpreters. Additionally, over 70 post-secondary educational institutions nationwide offer programs to prepare sign language interpreters. Graduates of these programs represent a group of professionals who have been trained to provide interpretation services for deaf and hearing people. The role of an interpreter is to facilitate communication between deaf and hearing people. Interpreters work in any life arena where people have the need to communicate. The next section of this videotape will address some specifics regarding the role and responsibility of an interpreter. Sign language interpreters who are members of the RID are guided by a code of professional conduct known as the Code of Ethics. This code is intended to protect the interests of those deaf and hearing individuals who work with an interpreter. Since the nature of interpreting is very sensitive, with the inclusion of a third person in what are traditionally direct human interactions, it is imperative that the interpreters conduct themselves in an ethical manner. The Code of Ethics is based on 5 basic tenets, not uncommon to any professional service provider. These tenets are: assignment information should be kept confidential. Interpretations should be complete, accurate, and inclusive of the intent and mood of the message. Interpreters should function as impartial participants in the communication process. Interpreters should use discretion in accepting assignments and setting fees. Professional conduct and commitment to all the standards is expected at all times. Application of these standards ensures that hearing and deaf persons can conduct their interactions without interference or outsider influence. Imagine the problems that would arise if an interpreter lost the ability to be impartial during a medical procedure, counseling session, or disciplinary review with a supervisor. Consider the distrust and confusion that would arise if an interpreter discussed the specifics of assignments with members of the deaf community, staff members within a given agency, or with anyone willing to listen. Imagine the consequences and misunderstandings that would arise if an interpreter did not accurately interpret directions for taking prescribed medicines, the terms and conditions of a loan agreement, or performance expectations during a job review. A fundamental aim of the Code of Ethics is to enable deaf and hearing persons to conduct their business in the most natural and direct manner possible. It is very important to remember that only individuals who are members of the RID have formally pledged to adhere to the Code of Ethics. Individuals acting as interpreters may claim to follow the Code of Ethics, but they are under no formal obligation to do so. If an individual is not a member of RID, violations of the Code of Ethics may simply go unchallenged. However, RID members who violate the Code of Ethics may be brought before a grievance committee, and appropriate disciplinary action may result. Since working with an interpreter is not always a commonplace event, people are sometimes a little awkward and unsure about how to proceed. Here are 10 practical suggestions for how you can help to ensure that the interpreter's roles and responsibilities are clear, and that everyone uses the interpreter services in an appropriate manner. It is not always the deaf person's responsibility to schedule an interpreter. If your office has decided to involve a deaf person in a meeting, for example, Your office has the ultimate responsibility of ensuring that an interpreter will be available for that meeting. Your office may contact the deaf person to see if he or she has a preference for a particular interpreter, or your office may ask if the deaf person would prefer to make the arrangements for an interpreter. At some point, your office may negotiate directly with the interpreter or with an interpreter referral agency. At that point, you should be prepared to provide the following information: date, time, place of the meeting, and expected length of the meeting. You should also be prepared to negotiate the rate of pay for the interpreter. Communicate your comments and questions directly to the deaf person rather than the interpreter. Encourage everyone else to do the same. Anything you want to know about deafness, deaf people, or sign language is best addressed by the deaf persons involved. Likewise, any information that you want to know about the hearing world and English should be addressed by hearing persons other than the interpreter. Any concerns participants have about one another should be discussed directly with each other rather than the interpreter. The interpreter is available to enable you to interact directly. Discuss the role of the interpreter and the interpreting process with the deaf and hearing participants and with the interpreter present. This encourages a common understanding and agreement regarding communication decisions and protocol. Periodically check in with each other to verify comfort and understanding. Be willing to make adjustments in pausing, positioning, and turn-taking as needed. Provide the interpreter with an overview of what will be transpiring during the assignment before the assignment begins. Conduct any general social interactions with the interpreter during breaks or before and after an assignment. Be prepared for the interpreter to interpret all information that is transmitted. Do not request the interpreter to not interpret something. This always places someone at a disadvantage and fosters a sense of distrust. It is also important to consider the lighting of the room where the interpretation is occurring. Lighting which is indirect, poor, or low will make it difficult to see the interpretation or the deaf person signing and will cause eye fatigue. In many interactions, good room lighting will be sufficient. Avoid light directly behind the interpreter or the deaf person. Direct light from a window or lamp can also make it difficult to see. Whenever visual aids or demonstration will be used, allow time for a shift from the interpreter to the visual aid. Although most hearing people are accustomed to reading or watching a visual presentation at the same time they are listening to someone speaking, this does not work in sign language. Clear, distinct pauses must occur between a comment and reference to a visual in order for the deaf person to access all information. This becomes particularly important when notes are being taken. Minimize movement while using an interpreter. Important communication exchanges can occur while walking down the hall with someone. However, it is extremely difficult for a deaf person to watch an interpreter while simultaneously moving to another location. It is equally distracting if there is a lot of movement around or in front of an interpreter during a communication exchange. Seek clarification when something doesn't make sense, and, when needed, be flexible. Remember that interpretation requires time and thought, and that an accurate interpretation is the responsibility of everyone involved. Be prepared to communicate your ideas and thoughts clearly and attend to the communication process. These 10 suggestions can greatly enhance the likelihood of a successful communication exchange between deaf and hearing persons. There are some additional considerations that are specific to communication exchanges which occur in one-to-one, in small group, and in platform or lecture situations. In general, the common issues that must be addressed in every interpreted interaction are positioning, general physical factors, and turn-taking protocol. During one-to-one interactions, the interpreter should be positioned in a location that will allow the deaf and hearing person to interact as directly as possible. This often means that the interpreter sits or stands beside and a little behind the hearing member of the interaction. This enables direct eye gaze between the deaf and hearing persons while allowing the deaf person to view the interpretation. The interpreter will strive to maintain a low profile during such interactions. It is common during one-to-one situations for an interpreter to use what is called a consecutive interpretation format. This means that the interpreter will wait to receive a complete thought before beginning the interpretation in order to make sure that the interpretation is clear and coherent. Research has shown that there are significant grammatical differences between American Sign Language and English. These differences are best accommodated when the interpreter takes time to receive a complete thought and then renders an equivalent interpretation. When an interpreter uses a consecutive interpretation format, there will be brief periods of time, a few seconds, when there may be silence. This is because the interpreter is processing information being received and is preparing to render the interpretation. This type of pausing may feel awkward at first, but will soon become a natural part of your interpreted interactions. One-to-one interactions are usually less formal than small group or large group situations. Because of this, there is more opportunity to clarify information and to confirm understanding. Thus, the interpreter may periodically ask for clarification of a message, the meaning of a specific term, or the correct spelling of a term. This is done so that the interpreter can generate the most accurate and equivalent interpretation possible. One of the most frustrating aspects of small group interactions that include deaf and hearing persons is turn-taking. Invariably, people will speak out of turn, talk over one another, and proceed without established turn-taking protocol. Because an interpreter cannot interpret two people's comments at the same time, effective interpreting can only occur when there are established and agreed upon rules for when to speak and when to pause. Because there is always a certain amount of lag time associated with interpreting, the interpreter is often completing one thought when someone begins to comment or ask a question. Ideally, the facilitator of the meeting will monitor all interactions to make sure that there are pauses after complete thoughts and whenever there is a change in speakers. It is also helpful to establish signals for turn-taking, such as raising a hand and waiting to be recognized by the facilitator, or some other effective signal. Another issue relevant to small group interactions relates to visibility. It is important for seating arrangements to allow all participants to see one another. This enables both deaf and hearing participants to know who is speaking and to feel integrated into the process. Round table interactions are usually the most conducive to everyone's full view. The interpreter should be placed in a location visible to the deaf person. Generally, the most appropriate location for the interpreter is next to the group facilitator. Additionally, whenever possible, the background in the room should be solid with minimal noise distraction. Whenever charts, graphs, or any visuals will be used, visibility is an important consideration. Not only is it important that the participants and the interpreter be able to see the visual aids, but also the interpreter must remain in a lighted area while visuals are being presented. It is also important to remember to pause between presenting the visual aids and any comments or discussion about the aids. Often, 2 interpreters are needed for small group meetings. This need is influenced by the number of participants in the group, the length of the meeting, and the content to be addressed. Interpreter fatigue is much greater for small group interactions than for one-to-one situations. The more participants involved, the more concentration and processing is required. Also, if the group will break into smaller discussion groups, and if there are several deaf participants, more than one interpreter will be needed to accommodate full participation of all the deaf participants. It may also be necessary to establish a schedule of more frequent breaks to provide rest from both physical and eye fatigue. In addition to all of the recommendations noted above, there are a few other special considerations for large group interactions. These are interactions when an interpreter will work with a speaker or group of speakers on a stage or platform. For example, due to distance and visibility issues, the background behind the interpreter and lighting of the interpreter become critical issues during platform interpreting situations. This is particularly true if there is open seating and deaf participants are seated throughout the audience. The interpreter should be in a location where there will not be constant movement and traffic, away from doorways, curtain entrances, and aisles. Interpreters will tend to sign bigger in order to make their signs more visible and may request or arrange for more frequent pausing to have ample opportunity to present the most accurate interpretation. Separate lighting may be required for the interpreter if the general lighting conditions are poor. Attention should also be given to the placement of loudspeakers, microphones, overheads, and other equipment. These pieces of equipment should be placed in positions which will support the interpreted process. For example, if the speaker is a deaf person, the microphone needs to be accessible to the interpreter rather than to the deaf presenter. If at all possible, speakers should be encouraged not to read their presentations. When presentations are written, there is an increase in grammatical complexity, and when those presentations are read, there is usually an increase in speaking or signing speed. Either of these factors alone make interpreting the message more difficult. Whenever possible, interpreters and presenters should meet ahead of the presentations to discuss format, goals, and content. Due to the level of formality generally associated with platform interpreting, interpreters often work in teams. These teams work to support each other during the interpreting process and may relieve each other during agreed-upon intervals. One reason teams of interpreters are so important is to accommodate question and answer periods. For example, if a deaf speaker is presenting, one interpreter and a backup interpreter is needed to render the remarks into spoken English. Another team of interpreters may be needed to interpret any questions that might come from deaf or hearing audience members. Another reason a team of interpreters may be used is to accommodate varying language preferences of deaf audience members. For example, some deaf audience members may prefer to access the presentations in American Sign Language, while others may prefer an English-coded system of signing. This would require the use of a team of interpreters and transliterators who would be positioned in different locations on the platform. As the number of interpreters increases, so does the need for planning and clear communication of roles and responsibilities. A final issue worth mentioning concerns payment. Individuals who employ interpreters are often unsure about what is a fair and reasonable hourly rate or salary for interpreters. There are many factors that influence the rate of payment interpreters should receive for their services. Geographic location, certificates and academic credentials, general working conditions, and length and complexity of the assignment. Proficiency in interpretation requires competence in a number of areas in addition to competence in sign language and English. It should be clear that simply being able to communicate using sign language does not qualify someone to function as an interpreter. Interpreters are professional service providers who, if they are members of RID, are governed by an established code of professional conduct. One general standard for payment, then, is that interpreters should receive a professional standard of pay. All interpreted situations require some advanced planning and thought. However, the rewards of successful human interactions are worth the time and effort required. Effective use of an interpreter can be achieved by understanding of the role of an interpreter as a mediator of language between two persons who do not share a common language, and by applying the recommendations outlined in this videotape. It is not always the deaf person's responsibility to schedule an interpreter. Communicate comments and questions directly to the deaf person rather than the interpreter. Discuss the role of the interpreter and the interpreting process with the deaf and hearing participants and with the interpreter present. Periodically check in with each other to verify comfort and understanding. Provide the interpreter with an overview of what will be transpiring during the assignment before the assignment begins. Be prepared for the interpreter to interpret all information that is transmitted. Consider the lighting of the room where the interpretation is occurring. Whenever visual aids or demonstration will be used, allow time for a shift from the interpreter to the visual aid. Minimize movement while using an interpreter. Remember that interpretation requires time and thought, and that an accurate interpretation is the responsibility of everyone involved. It is also important to hire qualified interpreters. For additional information about hiring and working with an interpreter, contact your local interpreter referral agency or the National Office of the RID Incorporated. Remember, communication is central to our well-being in any aspect of our lives. A commitment to effective communication processes, especially those involving sign language interpreters, is a commitment to ourselves and our community.